Hello and welcome to another week of Western Perspective. After months of campaigning, slogans and debates, the Perth Council election has come and gone. As the dust settles for the mayoral and candidate race, we join political expert Dr Ian Cook for an analysis into what the result means for the city in the next 4 years.
Ian, thanks for your time. What's your take on the election results?
The result was, to some extent, as I'd been expecting. I was always thinking that Basil Zempoulis's sort of public profile would be, fundamental and crucial for getting him over the line. And in some ways, the counting was pretty much exactly like that. People who knew more or less what was going on, the people who tended to vote early in postal, in the postal voting, they had a clearer sense of the candidates. I think the people who voted later were probably responding much more to limited information because, the last people probably just sort of make up their mind at the last moment. And the name can often just be the crucial factor in that moment. I recognise that name. At least I have some connection to the person I'm voting for. I'm not voting for a complete unknown. So I think that when I look at the voting, I think it just sort of shows that Basil Zempoulis being a well-known candidate was something that sort of dragged him across the line, because in the process of postal voting, the people voting later, I felt, were more likely to look at names and celebrity and be affected by that rather than policy. And so I think that's sort of an important part of the explanation.
Total vote is 6,300 votes. His margin is 284 against Di Bain. Is that a good margin? I
mean, that's a very close result. I think Di Bain should feel really pleased with herself and having come so close. I mean, I think that was a really great race she ran. So this isn't a decisive outcome. This isn't a landslide. This is a close result. And Di Bain's supporters need to be taken into account.
What about Sandy Angie? Do you believe that her existence pulls some votes away from Di Bain too?
Well, I mean, I think that some of the other candidates were really likely to take votes from Di Bain rather than Basil Zempoulis, because I guess there was a sort of slightly more progressive side of the ticket, and the more progressive candidates were tending to sort of take votes from each other. And I think that, whereas Zempoulis, 6PR lines up with a sort of more conservative perspective and position, and I think, there were probably more sort of progressives in this race, and the progressives tended to take votes from each other.
Here's the more interesting viewpoint. What does it mean for young people for the next 4 years?
Well, I mean, I think that we've got to be careful here to give Basil Zempoulis some time. He learned his lesson about what he said about the homeless and just forcing the homeless people out of Perth. So they're sort of learning. He's talking to people, so that's a good sign. And I think the needs of young people in the inner city areas are really extreme, and I think that's a really important place to service the interests of young people and the needs of young people. So I think the Perth City has a real obligation, and I'd like to see Basil Zempoulis step up. I'm not sure with his conservative background, he will adopt the sort of policies I think would be better.
Several mayoral candidates also ran as a councillor as well, and Di Bain got in. And also Sandy Angie got in. In fact, Sandy Angie has the highest votes amongst all the candidates combined. This certainly plays a role when it comes to the mayoral race as to influence the councillors.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. Being involved in the mayoral race got your name up there and into the sort of got public attention, and that was part of that name recognition factor. So running for mayor meant that when people were voting for councillor, they could look, I didn't vote for that person for mayor, but I might vote for councillor, and just that sense of having known their name, is another reason. So it's a good strategy. If you want to be a councillor, put your name down as mayor, and then just to sort of get your name out there in a much more significant and powerful way than as just another person running for council.
What's your final observation?
Well, I think that, I was a little concerned about some of the things that Basil Zempoulis said early on. As I say, he's walked most of those back. He has profile. I mean, in some ways he's got national profile. And, if COVID is over and people can actually come to Western Australia, this is a good way of promoting Perth. And so I think that, we could see Basil Zempoulis using his profile to help the City of Perth, and I think that would be a really good outcome. I want him to pay attention to sort of social justice issues and the sort of social needs of locality. But in terms of sort of boosting tourism and attention of Perth, I think it could be a really great asset for the city.
And now the AMA WA's President Dr Andrew Miller provides his weekly COVID-19 update.
Hi, thanks for your time this afternoon to express a few thoughts about where we're at in Australia with COVID. Victoria, firstly, obviously really harsh lockdown, devastating for a lot of people. over there, but coming towards the end and seeing some hope with low case numbers, although still a reasonable number of cases that they're not sure where they came from. So it's not just about numbers, it's also about distribution across the area, but hopefully they'll get to a stage of being able to further ease restrictions very soon, so that people's lives and businesses and so on can start heading back towards normal, and we can start to normalise movement in and out of Victoria. Now, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about borders in Western Australia this week, a little bit confusing about what the advice has been at various times, but very clearly the Chief Health Officer's finished off the week by saying that the borders need to remain closed until we get some really clear understanding that there's no community spread in other states. Now, that I think was validated by the sudden arrival of lots of people from New Zealand into both Victoria and into Western Australia in the last day or two, and that is not of great concern because of where they're coming from, but it simply shows that we don't have full cooperation, I think, between the federal government and the state governments. We don't know who's arriving into the state until the plane lands, and then they have to be processed. One thing about the processing, can't be too hard to set up a private interview for each person coming in, the same way that we do, say, with passport control internationally. Would be highly desirable that people's personal reasons for needing to come into the state can be discussed with the police officer without everyone else in the line hearing what's going on, and sometimes very personal mental health or physical threats in domestic violence situations. People shouldn't have to do that in front of others. So if that's occurring, it needs to be improved in that process, and that's part of what we're calling for in terms of a smart border, having clear criteria for people to come in, the people being able to get an easy answer about whether they're good to go and can come into the state. Very much welcome the government's move towards home quarantine with that system of being able to check people's location using technology. That's smart. Let's do more of that, and I don't see why it couldn't also be applied to international travellers coming in, so that we can reduce our reliance on quarantine hotels, which we know have been a source of spread and leak into the community. But we also have to have technology good enough that we can keep an eye on people who are doing the wrong thing, because we know that a portion of people will always want to do the wrong thing. This worrying rise in fights between politicians, between state and federal, sits in my mind because of what's happening in aged care. So aged care facilities, very vulnerable. They have a workforce who are often part-time and working other jobs, low-paid workers, not a background of working in healthcare usually. So the infection control for these patients when they turn positive is very important, that people who have had the adequate training, that they have the adequate facilities and access to the right PPE. So in terms of PPE, I came out making some strong comments this week that we need to be more precautionary in this area. I just don't think we're getting cut through, and I think that that's something that's languishing a bit, and that the Commonwealth standard is too low. It doesn't take into account the unpredictability and of aerosol spread from these patients, and essentially what I'm looking for is a Singaporean level of PPE. If we could go to Singapore level PPE in times of high community spread, particularly dealing with suspected or COVID positive patients with the best PPE that we can get, seems to me to be a great insurance for our businesses. And if you're a business person, you're worried about the borders opening up, you're worried about the future of your business if this starts to spread in our very vulnerable community, a community that has more freedoms than pretty much anywhere else in the world at the moment. If that's what you're worried about, I think get onto your politicians and start saying, why are we not using Singapore level PPE? Because if our healthcare workers are getting infected, as they did in very high rates in Victoria, the risk of lockdown becomes much greater. And lockdown's a very blunt tool. So we need to have good tracking, tracing, isolating, PPE, get all those things in place. We're seeing more and more ships turning up, of course, which is entirely predictable, because lots of people who work on ships, of course, from very low socioeconomic countries, developing nations, and they have to keep working whether they're sick or they're not sick, and the disease is spreading very rapidly through those communities, such as the Philippines. So we can expect to see lots more of these ships. We need to have Again, really good cooperation between the state and the federal government, and we're just not seeing this at the moment. We're seeing lots of squabbling going on even between federal and state politicians within our own state. So let's examine the arguments carefully. Let's understand where the risk is coming from. Let's remember that the enemy is the virus, but we also need to have really good responses as far as testing, tracking, tracing, isolating, and PPE and all the other risk controls in our facilities around ventilation. Extremely important. We're seeing this disease spread within gymnasiums. There's an outbreak in a gym in Canada where they're pretty much following most of the rules, but it seems as though that sort of heavy exercise indoors, as you might expect, rapid spread. So stay safe. Remember, COVID is out there. We are not over it by any means, as Europe and Middle East and other places are seeing going into their third wave now. So let's just get prepared as a community. Positive, constructive discussion to move things forward. Thanks, appreciate your time today.
And that's all for this week. We'll be back with another episode of WP next time, but until then, it's back to you, Ivan and Sarah.
Thank you, Nelson. And that's our weekly news and current affairs. We have the latest news on our website and social media pages.
No matter where you're watching, look after yourselves and we'll see you next Sunday.
Wish you good health and good night.